And we're back, guys, right here on WWE Network and Chill as I, Graham G. Matthews, break down all the original content I watch on the WWE Network. Today we're talking the second ever episode of Broken Skull Sessions with Stone Cold Steve Austin and his very special guest, Goldberg. This was a great show, much like the Undertaker one, learning a lot of stories I wasn't already familiar with, and just to see Goldberg kind of open up and share stories that we haven't heard from him before, I thought was great. Not quite as fascinating as the Undertaker one from 3 weeks ago, and it's crazy to think it was just so, like, it feels like it was yesterday that I saw that Taker special with Stone Cold 3 weeks ago. But yeah, it was in fact 3 weeks ago. It feels like it just happened. It would be cool if this became a regular thing after every pay-per-view that they had big names here on the show. Because Stone Cold's original podcast on the network was very good, but it came to a certain point where he was having people on that it was like, okay, but why? You know, like we've seen Ric Flair with Stone Cold before, and yeah, you know, it wasn't really... It really, honestly, wasn't that memorable of an interview when they sat down, and I think late 2015. The Shawn Michaels one was good too, but not really must-see. The Goldberg one was great because we haven't really heard too much from Goldberg before. Now, he's been on Austin's podcast before, many, many years ago. Maybe not discussing wrestling in depth as much as they did here, but just to see the video of them interacting and stuff like that is worth it alone to check it out. The Taker one was even more special just because we never see Taker do those type of interviews ever at all, and it was great stuff. And a lot like that one, though, this Goldberg one did kind of... It touched upon everything I wanted them to touch upon except for two things. One, the Matt Riddle fiasco, which I didn't expect Austin to touch upon just because he may not be all that aware of it. I mean, it's a relatively recent thing, but it would have been cool to hear from Goldberg and his side of the story as to what Matt Riddle's beef with him is. As well as the Undertaker match from June at Super Showdown. Now, Taker did touch upon it very briefly, and we know that Austin watched the match because he touched upon it very briefly in that Taker interview 3 weeks ago. So we know that he's aware of the match. We know this was taped after the fact, but there was not a single mention of that match here on this show. They practically ended it on that WrestleMania match that he had with Brock back at WrestleMania 33, which was awesome, and I'll get into that momentarily. But I thought it was weird that he never talked about the Taker match, which was a fucking disaster. And maybe they did and they cut it out. I don't know. I thought that part of the promotion for this podcast was that he was going to talk about the Taker stuff. He actually talked about the Taker stuff more in interviews than he did here in this interview with Stone Cold. So I thought that was a bit weird. But putting that aside, that's merely nitpicking. Overall, I thought this was a great interview between Goldberg and Stone Cold Steve Austin. So we'll run down my news and notes here from the podcast and the highlights of what they were talking about here, of their conversation. So Goldberg, right off the bat, talks about being mistaken for Stone Cold Steve Austin constantly. Not only back in the Attitude Era when it would really piss him off, because obviously they were competitors at the time. They were in opposing promotions. They hated being compared to each other, and I can see the similarities, but overall, though, they're two totally different people. But then again, though, to outsiders, people that aren't hardcore wrestling fans, I kind of get it. You see two bald guys with goatees. I could see why they would be compared and kind of be mistaken for one another. The funny thing is that Goldberg actually brought up an instance from literally a week before this was taped in Milwaukee. He was at the airport and someone said to him, "Hey, don't you look, have you ever gotten that you look like Stone Cold Steve Austin? Because you kind of look like him," that type of thing. And he got a little annoyed because the dude, in this situation anyway, has his fucking passport right there. He has all of his information right there in front of him, and he's not even reading his name to see that his name is not Stone Cold Steve Austin. You know what I mean? Like the guy who's making it sound like he thought it was Stone Cold, clearly it's not. So it was one of those type of things. It's like, no, dude, you're talking to Bill Goldberg, another guy who could just eat you alive right here, right now if he wanted to. But I thought that was funny. And again, right off the bat, they discussed the dream match between the two that never actually happened and why it never happened. It could have, when Goldberg came back to WWE in 2003, but by that point it was too late. Goldberg debuted in the company literally the night after. You could not have come any closer if you tried than if he just came in like 2 seconds after, Austin's last match at WrestleMania. But he debuted in WWE the night after Stone Cold Steve Austin had his final match with the company at WrestleMania 19. You could not cut it any closer. But Stone Cold talks about it because Goldberg brings up how he said in an interview right around this time, this was literally like a month or two ago, when Austin said on his own podcast he had gone ahead and said, I could come out of retirement if I wanted to and all this other stuff. And he was not saying he could wrestle again, that he wanted to wrestle again. He was saying physically, if he wanted to, he could. I mean, aside from the neck stuff, I guess that doesn't really either bother him anymore or something along those lines, where he had said on his podcast, theoretically, could I come out of retirement? Yes. And people obviously took that out of context and ran with it as, Stone Cold said he could come back, blah, blah, blah. The thing is, though, if he was going to come back, he would have come back by now. I know Shawn Michaels came out of retirement 8 years later, blah, 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 but that was 8 years later. Stone Cold's been out of the ring now for, almost 17 years? He retired in 2003. It's almost 2020. It's been 17 years. He's not wrestling another match. So just get over it, people. And Stone Cold just says flat out, I wish you came to WWE sooner. I wish you were here sooner so we could have that match. And Goldberg talks about how when he first came to WWE, the powers that be kind of kept him away from Stone Cold Steve Austin, maybe to avoid conflict or whatever, but they enjoyed working with each other. They enjoyed their presence, each other's presence. They became close friends almost immediately. And not only that, but Austin actually welcomed himself to Goldberg when he came to WWE. He actually welcomed him to the territory as soon as he got there, which I thought was pretty cool. Goldberg also talked about how he had a reputation that he was hard to work with in WCW, then when he came to WWE. And then he just goes all the way back to when he started watching wrestling, way back when in Oklahoma with his grandmother. That's actually who he grew up watching wrestling with, which is pretty funny. And that his family and friends were all involved in the business in some form or fashion. Either they were fans, watching the product, or I don't think they were wrestlers, obviously, but they were all involved in some form or fashion over the years. So Austin even said that he was destined to be a part of that business at some point or another. But obviously that was not his first choice, his first career path. He talks about getting into football. And how he talks about his whole journey throughout football and how it ended, how it started, that type of thing. That he partied too hard at the Gator Bowl years ago, and as a result, he kind of got snubbed by the NCAA drug policy, and as a result, it cost him in the NFL draft soon after, so he couldn't get drafted. Or at least it hurt his chances of getting drafted, something along those lines. I'm not entirely familiar with football, as you could probably tell, but it hurt his chances in the draft of getting drafted higher, probably. But he ended up signing with the Falcons, the Atlanta Falcons. During the season, he got hurt, and right after that, he got drafted by Carolina. And after getting drafted there, he realized, listen, I'm just too hurt. I can't do this anymore. And he had to retire from football because he realized that injuries were going to cost him his career. So he had to kind of end that rather quickly, which hurt himself, hurt his pride because he loved football so much, and that was what he really wanted to do. But as a result of that, his accountant or whatever realized, like, listen, dude, you didn't make millions when you were in the NFL, so you got to start doing something. So he transitioned into main event fitness, the fitness world, that type of stuff. While he was there, he met Diamond Dallas Page, and I think that was, I want to say it was based out of Atlanta, where he lived at the time, or not grew up in, but that was where he lived, coming out of the after playing with the Falcons. So as a result of that, he met a lot of people that were working with WCW back then, including Diamond Dallas Page, Randy Savage, Sting, a lot of other people. He actually knew the Steiners, probably either from the gym or even prior to that point. I'm not exactly sure, but he knew him. He knew Rick Steiner, Scott Steiner, and Sting all very well before he ended up joining WCW. And as a result of his connections with them and Diamond Dallas Page kind of signing him on, convincing him to try out wrestling, he went to the Power Plant. He reported to the Power Plant, which was basically WCW's version of the Performance Center back in the day. And he credits Sarge, who was in charge of the Power Plant back then, who I think Batista had talked about years ago when he tried out for WCW and how he really pushed him to his limits. And I don't know if Batista had that same respect for Sarge that that Goldberg does, because Sarge was the one who really kind of broke him into the business. He helped train him, and Goldberg even admitted that he didn't really stand out all too much during the initial tryout because there were a lot of monsters there. And Goldberg's a big guy, but there were a lot of other big guys during his tryout, so he didn't really stand out as much as he thought he hoped or as much as he thought he would. But he respected Sarge, and he said that without Sarge, he would not have made it to where he was, or where he is today, because he would not have helped him get into WCW, because he was really crucial to his career early on. So anyway, he talked about how if you come from any certain sport, like a pro sport, if you have any notoriety before you go to WCW or even a place like WWE, specifically the power plant, they're going to try to break you in. They're going to try to make you not want to do this. And he realized to himself, he said to himself, listen, I'm going to make sure no one breaks me. And that's exactly what happened. He made sure that no one broke him. So he ended up making it to WCW, got signed. He worked as Bill Gold. That's what his name was, Bill Gold, during the dark matches before he started working TV. And they asked him when he went to TV, like, oh, what do you want your name to be? Because his name actually is Bill Goldberg, of course, but he wanted a ring name. And he said, oh, what about the Hybrid? Which honestly isn't that bad of a name. But they said, oh, no, we can't do that. And he's like, why not? It's a cool name. And they said, well, it's a trademarking thing because once we make merchandise for it, all this other stuff, we can't trademark it, so we can't do that. He didn't really think about that type of thing because obviously, I mean, he grew up watching wrestling, but he wasn't really all that familiar with the business and how things work behind the scenes. He had no idea. He was coming to this thing completely cold. So he was like, fine, whatever, just call me Goldberg. And that stuck, obviously, and it was a great ring name because it was short, sweet, simple, straight to the point. It was perfect for him. So anyway, he talked about how there was no planning early on. The whole streak thing was not something that was planned in advance. There was no long-term plan for Goldberg. He just got over organically. He found out, he found out about stuff from week to week. Even the Hogan match he talked about, he had said that was something he found out when everyone else found out. When they found out on TV that he would be facing Hulk Hogan for the WCW World Championship live on Nitro in Atlanta, that was when he found out too. But speaking of Hogan, he actually credits him for giving him a lot of advice, including that less is more. Try to do less during your matches to get over more, and it ended up working, obviously, to a great extent for him. Sarge was another one who had told him to kind of slow down, take your time, don't really pick up the pace if you don't have to, because that was the style that Goldberg worked. He didn't have to go out there and do flips. He didn't have to go out there and work at a million miles an hour. He could just go out there, hit one big power move, and have that be it, and people would go nuts for it because of the monster that he was, I think I just messed up my mic there. I apologize. Kind of like contorted here, trying to get comfortable while I'm recording. But nonetheless, so Sarge had told him, slow down, just do your thing, get comfortable in the ring, and, at some point you will see it'll pay dividends, and it did. But he also talked about how, they also first showed back his Hugh Morris match, the debut match that he had on Nitro with Hugh Morris, otherwise known as, what's his fucking name? Bill DeMott. Bill DeMott. He had his first ever match on Nitro with Bill DeMott. They watch it back, and Austin just brings up how much he loved Goldberg's intensity. He thought that was one of the best parts about Goldberg was his intensity. And Goldberg even said, listen, I just did what was asked of me. I just went out there and did whatever they told me to do. I was trying to be the best team player I possibly could, and, other people would get mad that he wasn't selling, that he couldn't lose, blah, blah, blah. You're a top-tier talent. Why are you getting pushed? He was like, listen, dude, I'm just going out there and doing what they're telling me. I'm not politicking. I'm not going out there and saying, I want to keep the streak alive, all this other shit. I'm just doing what they're telling me to do. So no heat on me, brother. Don't worry about me. Go have an issue with the office. Take it up with the office if you have an issue with it. But otherwise, I'm just doing what I'm being told to do. But anyway, so he actually talks about, it's not one of those things where Goldberg had maintained hey, I want to stay undefeated, I need to keep the streak alive, that he fought for the streak staying alive. There was actually one point during the streak, probably early on, where he had faced Bobby Eaton in his hometown. And Goldberg wanted to lose to Bobby Eaton because he said that Bobby Eaton helped him out a lot. And he wanted to pay it forward by losing to Eaton in his hometown. And he was actually convinced out of it. Because they were like, listen, that would have been, that's fucking dumb. You can't lose to Bobby Eaton. You can't squash the streak now. We're not doing that. And he didn't understand why at the time, because he didn't really get the business. But he ended up coming around to the realization oh, yeah, if I did lose there, that would have been stupid. And Bobby Eaton, it would have been a big moment for him, obviously. But it wouldn't have meant anything because the streak was just kind of starting to take off as opposed to being at its full zenith. So for him to lose at that point in time would have been just fucking dumb. He didn't really get it until much later on. But anyway, he talks about how he saw Stone Cold Steve Austin as the enemy. So seeing him and hearing about him really pissed him off, not because he hated Steve Austin, but because he was the enemy. He was the competitor, and he really had to do everything in his power to kind of establish his own identity that's separate of Stone Cold Steve Austin, because there was a lot of similarities between the two pushes and their two builds and their respective looks and whatnot and how similar they were. He had to go out there and be his own person. So they watched back the Hulk Hogan match from Nitro when he won the World Championship, such a big moment, and how there was 44,000 people in that Georgia Dome that night, and how they only announced the match on the Thursday before the show. Literally like 3 or 4 days before that episode of Nitro, they advertised as that match happening. It was like, holy shit. And Goldberg even said, imagine how many more people we could have fit into that arena had they announced it even earlier than that, like the Monday prior on Nitro. They didn't even announce the thing a week out. They waited until Thursday to announce it, I think on either Thunder or maybe not on their website. It was fucking 98, but it was around that time. Like, holy shit, imagine how much bigger that moment would have been, could have been, had they announced it earlier than they did or saved it for a pay-per-view. But obviously, Goldberg was from Atlanta, so it was smart of them to hold it on that episode of Nitro and not probably wait until a pay-per-view, where it would have been big, but maybe not as big as it ended up being, because it was a big match in a smaller, maybe not venue, but in a smaller, it was an episode of Nitro, so it meant a lot more than if it was like a friggin' second match on a card on Starrcade or something like that, So it ended up paying off big time for him. It was a great moment, and the match was good. Hogan actually ribbed him, Goldberg said, by putting Icy Hot under his arms. When Goldberg, whenever he had to lift him up during the match, he had his hands burning because Hogan had Icy Hot under his arms whenever he had to lift him up, which I thought was kind of funny. But he said the coolest part about that night, that title win, and one of the coolest parts of his career, and not to take a shot at the business, he says, but it was the fact that the Falcons were there in the front row watching him do his thing. Because for the longest time, he was a part of the Falcons, and for the longest time, he wanted to be them. He wanted to be on that football field, living out their dream, being them. But in that moment, they were the ones on the outside having the time of their lives, wanting to be him. And there was a really cool feeling that came with being the one that inspired not only all these other people in the audience, thousands upon thousands of people, tens of thousands of people, but the freaking Atlanta Falcons. And that's still something that he hangs his hat on today, and that's something that he can kind of sit back and realize, like, holy shit, I did that. Like, that's something he can just be content about, that he was the one that really just, that felt larger than life to the heroes that he grew up watching, that being the Atlanta Falcons, which is pretty fucking cool. He also talked about how getting to the WWE Hall of Fame ended up being way easier than ever being able to make it to the NFL Hall of Fame. Because if he continued on with his football career, maybe he would have been really, really successful. But he realized that he was a lot better at this wrestling thing, and that he was a lot luckier with this wrestling thing than he ever would have been with the NFL. And he probably would have floundered, continued to get hurt. He definitely would have never made it into the Hall of Fame for the NFL. So from there, they discussed the Starrcade 1998 main event between Goldberg and Kevin Nash. The infamous Starrcade main event with Goldberg and Kevin Nash, where the streak came to an end at the hands of Kevin Nash and his fucking stun gun, courtesy of Scott Hall. This was so stupid. I don't know if it was a stun gun, a fucking taser, a cattle prod, whatever the hell it was stupid. That's what it was. It was stupid. And Goldberg, shockingly enough, it was interesting to hear his comments on this, because he said he didn't really pass judgment on it at the time because he wasn't really all that familiar with the business. He thought it was just his time to lose. He thought it was time for him to lose, for him to pass the torch, so to speak, even though it was the fucking Kevin Nash, which is so ridiculous even in retrospect over 20 years later. He thought that was just, it was time. He thought it was time for him to, pass along the title to someone else and have that be it for the streak to end. He wasn't mad about it. He wasn't pissed the streak was over. He didn't take himself too seriously because he wasn't overly familiar with the business. And if he was, he probably would have been more pissed. This is a rare situation where Goldberg did not give a shit about losing. And I'm not talking about a rare situation in his case, but a rare situation where a wrestler is on top, they're doing really well, and they have no problem with losing all that steam because, again, he wasn't overly familiar with the business. Hulk Hogan, or rather Goldberg, actually called it the ultimate rib. He got beat with the fucking stun gun. It's still so dumb looking back on it over 20 years later. They also show the footage of him punching the limo window when I guess it was supposed to break because it was a gimmick window, and then it didn't, so he took it upon himself to punch it, straight out with his fist, and he either broke all the bones in his hand or he just broke his hand. I don't know exactly what the extent of the injuries were, but it was pretty bad. It looked fucking gross because there was blood everywhere, glass everywhere. It was just disgusting. I don't know if he was a heel at the time or if he turned heel soon after, whatever the timeline was, because Austin had brought up that it was like right before WCW had closed or right before, he got hurt or left. I don't remember. But the point of the matter is that it was a really dumb thing to do. And again, he just figured it was his time to lose. He figured it was his time to just ride off into the sunset, time to focus on someone else. It didn't really bother him. He wasn't creatively frustrated in WCW that they weren't giving him opportunities because he didn't really get it at the time. He didn't really understand that how they were booking him, what they were doing with him was fucking dumb, and it ruined any momentum the guy had way back when in like 98 when he was the world champion and undefeated and whatnot. So he had a guaranteed contract. And had no real reason to jump ship to WWE when everyone else did, a lot like Hogan and Nash and Hall and Flair and Sting and all these other people that ended up coming in way much later on. He had no reason to come in initially because he had that guaranteed contract. Why would he come in when he can why get paid half the money when he can get paid his full contract for doing nothing? Who the fuck wouldn't do that, Because Austin brought up about how, you weren't part of the invasion and who knows what it would have looked like if you were a part of it. Yeah, it probably would have been better. But honestly, again, he also would have been coming off his WCW run, would have been a lot hotter than he was in 2003 when he just wasn't the same guy that he was a few years earlier. And he lost some of that steam from being out of the public eye for so long. But yeah, he came in the night after WrestleMania 19 in 2003. And he said it was rough right from the get-go because this guy was the enemy years earlier, and of course WCW closed down 2 years prior, but still there was a lot of bad blood about him being in WCW. A lot of those guys that were his enemies when he was in WCW, they were in WWE too. They were also there at that time, including Triple H and, The Rock made occasional appearances, Stone Cold Steve Austin, who had no issue with Goldberg, but Triple H specifically, he kind of pointed it out that Triple H had an issue with Goldberg, which probably played a factor in Triple H pinning him at SummerSlam that year in that terrible Elimination Chamber match. And to my opinion, one of the weakest Elimination Chamber matches they've ever done was that one at SummerSlam 03 when Triple H pinned Goldberg with a fucking sledgehammer shot. How stupid, again, was that in retrospect? But anyway, so he talked about how it was rough and people didn't really want to see him succeed. They jump ahead from there to WrestleMania 20 and jokes about Vince hating him that night because, everyone knew that he was leaving and Brock Lesnar. So the crowd shit over the entire thing and the match sucked anyway. I'm sure that didn't help. The match probably would have been bad regardless. The issue is that it was built up so well. The build to that match was amazing. You watch the video package, great shit. The match sucked. It was a steaming pile of shit. He thought Brock wanted to kill him because Brock was also leaving, like I said. The crowd was shitting on him. They were shitting over both guys except for Stone Cold Steve Austin. It was the special guest referee that night. And Brock, he could see it in his eyes that the guy was seething. He thought he was pissed, but he thought he was so pissed that he was going to take it out on Goldberg. Thankfully, he didn't. And Goldberg even jokes, he's like, we should have just gone in the crowd and started tagging people. Probably meaning, what he probably meant to say was, we probably should have just gone in the crowd and started beating the shit out of those fans, which would have been 10 times more entertaining. And I'm sure part of that crowd probably deserved it. That would have made that match that much better, but they also probably would have gotten arrested, so maybe not. But I thought that was funny when he said that. But yeah, he said the match and just the overall run with WWE that year did not sit well with him because it ended on such a sour note. But not just that though, the overall run just wasn't good. It wasn't like he had this great triumphant run and the match that he ended his career on was bad. No, the overall run was just shit. He had a few cool moments when he first came in. Probably the first month was the hottest that he was in that entire run. Because he came in, he attacked The Rock from night one. They had a really good match, I thought, at Backlash 2003. I don't remember if the crowd was super into Goldberg that night. They were in Canada that night too. I don't remember, but I remember the match being really good. That was an overall great pay-per-view, Backlash 2003. And then after that, it just wasn't the same. Like, he was beating Chris Jericho and just randos and shit like that. Then the SummerSlam match happened, and that sucked. He became world champion, kind of a lackluster title reign. The feud with Triple H was nothing special. That went on forever. Then the Brock feud happened, and it was good, but then the match sucked. So overall, it just was not a good run. Didn't sit well with him. And he wanted to be part of the team. He was there to be a team player. He was there to be a part of WWE, make things be a success, and it wasn't. And he thought WWE succeeded in bringing him in as the guy who was the face of WCW, the enemy for a time, and just embarrassing him. And again, most of that was on the booking, but there were just a lot of different factors. He should have come in earlier. The matches just weren't good. The booking didn't help, but that overall match with Brock and Mania didn't. That was just a bad match. And that was just the bad circumstances, too, with people knowing that he was on his way out after WrestleMania. It's not like the match was bad and he's like, fuck this, I'm gone. He was leaving anyway. So, I mean, it's not like the match was so bad that it convinced him to leave. He was going to leave anyway, you know? But he talked about the unfinished business there and how that did not sit well with him for a very long time. He went to Japan after that, I guess, which I did not know. I'm not sure if he worked in New Japan or somewhere else, but he was with Japan for a little bit. So anyway, soon after that, he started filming some movies, and he was in Santa's Sleigh, like an evil Santa. I've never seen it, but I know he was in the movie. I've seen it in like fucking, not recently, but like when I used to go to like home rental video stores. Well before I started watching wrestling, I would see his face on the fucking poster for this Santa's Sleigh movie. Like, oh, like an evil Santa. That's interesting. But that was where he met his wife. He met his wife on the set of Santa's Sleigh, and he recalled the whole story about how he was supposed to come into this bar and beat the shit out of some people, and his wife was she was a stunt double, and they had all these like naked women all over the place because it was like a strip bar or something, but she was the only woman that was not naked, and how he kind of flirted with her, and he was like, he knew right off the bat that she was the one for him, which I thought was really cool. And he also tells this really funny story about how she talked to like the director or something. I don't know if it was the only reason why she did the movie, but she was excited to film this movie because she thought the main star in the movie was Jeff Goldblum, not Bill Goldberg. So when she found out it wasn't Jeff Goldblum and it was Bill Goldberg instead, the director, whoever, said to her, no, the famous wrestler Bill Goldberg. And she goes, what, that fake shit? It was so funny. But obviously they got married anyway 3 months later, which is kind of crazy. So congrats to them. That's awesome. They discuss his son and how much he means to Bill and all that other stuff. And then he talks about how he got the call to come back to WWE in 2016. And he really wanted to put it all out there, not for himself or not for his own ego or to kind of, to make up for the previous run from 2003, 2004. But also to really have his family see him wrestle for the first time. Because his son was born well after he stopped wrestling for WWE. So he wanted to kind of give him that one last run where they could see him do his thing. To give his family a glimpse of what he used to be, which is really cool. Stone Cold said that when Goldberg came back that night on Raw in October of 2016, I forgot where it was, Detroit maybe, or I forgot the exact city. They mentioned it here, but I didn't write it down. They were a great crowd, by the way. That was a great fucking moment. I was never the biggest Goldberg fan, but I was sold the fucking moment he came back. The second he returned, I was sold. Because that crowd treated him like an absolute star. And this was a guy that did not have a long run in WWE. He had a much longer run in WCW than he ever did in WWE. And he had not been talked about or brought up on TV in over a decade and a half. So the fact that these crowds, these fans went nuts for him for the first time in 13 years really meant something. And they realized this was a big deal, which I thought was awesome. Because they could have very well just booed him when he came out or not cared or whatever, but they treated him like a fucking megastar. And it was because of that reaction that he got the run that he did. I am convinced that if he came back and the crowd either didn't care or they didn't pop a rating, most importantly, or they booed him or whatever, they probably would have not booked him to beat Brock at Survivor Series. It would have been as originally planned, a one and done. He would have ridden off into the sunset, and had that been it, it probably, wouldn't have been all that great. Maybe the match wouldn't have been what it was. It would have been shit like the WrestleMania 20 match. And that also, a lot like his 03 and 04 run, would have been a complete waste of time. But Stone Cold said that when Goldberg went out that night on Raw, that he could see the doubt in his eyes. That Goldberg didn't know if he could still be the Goldberg of old. And that was even after he got the cheers that he did from the crowd. He thought he was going to go out there and just be booed. But he realized that this time around, he had to present a completely different package. He couldn't be the unstoppable, invincible Goldberg because the guy was 13 years older. He was in his 50s. He dropped some pounds, and the guy still looks like a fucking freak, an athletic freak. But he wasn't the same Goldberg that he was way back when. So he had to give them something different. And I thought this was so smart to hear him talk about this. I thought this was brilliant, that he used his family as an excuse. Not that he was a softie now, but he had to explain that, listen, I'm not Goldberg. I'm not the same Goldberg that he was in WWE back in 2003. I'm not the same Goldberg that he was back in WCW in 1998. I'm almost 20 years older, and that's because I have a family now. I've taken time off, and I need to kind of be the family guy now. I need to be the dad that he was, that I wasn't 15 years ago or whatever it was. So he has a reason for not being as immortal and as invincible as he once was, which I thought was fucking brilliant. So if he does go in there and get his ass kicked by Brock Lesnar, it's because he's a dad now, and it's because he has a family and he's not the same Goldberg that he was 20 years earlier in WCW. So the fact that he had said that and he explained that to the audience with that promo that he came back with on Raw in October of 2016, I thought was brilliant. And he explained that perfectly in his promo to that night, which is why people ate it up. And that also gave the people another reason to cheer him because he saw him as a family guy this time around. They saw him as the family man doing this for his son and not just doing it for himself, which is what kind of separated the Goldberg of 2016 from the Goldberg of 2003 or even 1998. But again, he talked about how he thought he was going to go out there and get booed, which he didn't. They just went nuts for the guy. He also credits C.T. Fletcher for really giving him confidence that he could be the Goldberg that he was 20 years earlier, telling him, listen, just go out there and be yourself. Just be Goldberg, be the fucking badass ass kicker that you were years ago, and people will buy into that. People will believe that. He also credited Paul Heyman, Brock Lesnar's very own manager, that if it wasn't for Paul Heyman, that comeback probably would have never happened. And Paul Heyman was as instrumental in the return of Goldberg to WWE 3 years ago as anybody. Because Paul Heyman was obviously, I don't know if he was as close with Goldberg during that original run in 2003 as he was in 2016, but he was a big reason why Goldberg had come in and was treated like this megastar. Again, if it wasn't for Paul Heyman, that run probably either wouldn't have happened or has gone as well as it did. Because Goldberg ended up going to Survivor Series, beating Brock in a minute and a fucking half. People went nuts. And again, right off the bat, despite the guy being 50-something years old and looking significantly older than the last time that we saw him, he was booked to be a badass. He was booked to be this one-man wrecking crew and to beat a guy like Brock Lesnar, who had gone undefeated in WWE for years after breaking the Undertaker's undefeated streak at WrestleMania a few years earlier. So right from the get-go, they solidified him as unstoppable. Despite the fact that he was older, he looked older, and he just wasn't the same guy that he was previously, they made him out to be this superhero that people could buy into, and it worked. He said that in talking about squashing Brock, they show some footage from the match from Survivor Series that year. He had said, and he was quoted in saying here, that if it didn't make money, they wouldn't have fucking done it. And obviously they bleep out the F word, but he talks about how they wouldn't have brought him back if it wasn't going to make them money. And he made them a lot of money during that run. And Goldberg's original run on the company was fucking shit, because they booked him to look like a complete loser for the better part of that year. But in bringing him back to beat Brock Lesnar, making him look like a superhero, they made a lot of money from merchandise, pay-per-view buys. Raw ratings were up because people wanted to see Goldberg. Now, of course, there's something to be said for building your show around a 50-year-old dude who's not going to be around in 4 months. I thought that was kind of a problem. And having him be the one to beat Brock after guys like Randy Orton couldn't, John Cena couldn't, The Undertaker couldn't. They built up Dean Ambrose, he couldn't, Roman Reigns, Seth Rollins. All these people were sacrificed to Brock Lesnar just so this guy that hadn't wrestled in 13 years and Goldberg could beat him. I thought that was a little nonsensical. But other than that, though, it worked, and it made Goldberg a lot of money. It made WWE a lot of money during that point in time. And the run just worked. He talked about being in the right place at the right time, and they kind of fast forward to the WrestleMania match for WrestleMania 33, and how he got amped up walking down the WrestleMania ramp that night, knowing in his mind that that could be his last match. He didn't really have a next date planned. His original plan, he only signed through with WWE through WrestleMania, from Survivor Series to Mania, and that was going to be it. Then he was going to ride off into the sunset, and of course he cut the promo the next night on Raw where he said, "Who's next? I don't know, blah, blah, blah." But it just worked, and And knowing that it was his last match, he was that much more motivated to go out there and have one of the best matches of his career. And honestly, I'm not going to lie to you. I haven't seen many of his WCW matches. I would have to go back and watch this stuff with Savage and Hogan and Diamond Dallas Page. They had some great matches back in the late 90s. But other than that, though, I will still say to this day that the Brock Lesnar match that these two had, the WrestleMania match that he and Brock had at WrestleMania 33, and I was there for it too, so maybe I'm biased. I thought that was the best match Goldberg ever had in WWE. Better than the Rock match from Backlash 03. Definitely better than any Triple H match, which bored me out of my fucking mind when I watched those matches because they just weren't good. The Brock match from WrestleMania 20 for sure. It was better than anything he had done ever before, and at least over a decade, obviously since he hadn't wrestled, but better than anything he had done in WWE prior to that point. It was exactly what it needed to be. And granted, it was only 5 minutes, but it was perfect. It was energetic. They wasted no time. He kicked out of the F5. Or no. He didn't kick out of the F5. Brock Lesnar kicked out of the jackhammer, which was a big moment. Because all it took was one jackhammer for Goldberg to beat Brock initially at Survivor Series. So that was really cool. The crowd was into it. I was on my feet the whole time. It was the perfect 4-minute match. Probably one of the better 4-minute matches I've ever seen. I thought it was awesome. But yeah, he talked about walking out in front of that crowd. He enjoyed himself for the first time in his entire career. And that goes for WWE, WCW, whatever. That he enjoyed being in the moment. And you could see him smiling in his, in Gorilla, being in Gorilla, walking out to the crowd, walking out through the crowd, on the ramp to the WrestleMania ring, that he was enjoying himself for the first time in his entire career. And I honestly think that would have been the best possible note to end on for him, that he should not have come back for one more match, because he ended on the best possible note. And they kind of threw that all away by having him come back for the fucking Undertaker match, which, again, they made no mention of on this episode of Broken Skull Sessions, which kind of was disappointing because I wanted to hear him poop on that match. Because he knows it was bad and he's kind of embarrassed and whatever, and I can understand why, but it would have been nice to hear his side of the story on a platform like this about how bad that match was. But anyway, I still say to this day that should have been the match he ended his career on. But anyway, he talked about, he joked actually about losing and how weird it was for him to lose. He didn't really know how to lose, because he didn't really lose all that often prior to WrestleMania 33. He didn't lose during his return run. He never really lost during the original run with WWE. He got pinned again at SummerSlam and during that Elimination Chamber match, again, which was terrible. And then he lost the World Championship a couple months after that. I don't think he was pinned, though. I think Kane got pinned. It was a triple threat with Kane, Goldberg, and Triple H pinned, I think, Kane to win the World Heavyweight Championship, if I'm not mistaken. But he hadn't lost a singles match in WWE in, since 2000, something like that, 1999, in almost 20 years. So he didn't really know how to lose. He forgot how to lose. And he felt cleansed by it. That was the word that he used, which was cool. And he said also it helped because there was no stamp of finality on it. He kind of thought it would be his last match, but it wasn't promoted as a retirement match. So there wasn't any added pressure, which is why it worked as well as it did. He also even said, I'm still learning the business. So I'm still kind of figuring things out even over 20 years later. And Stone Cold brings up his upcoming projects and all the other things he's working on. I guess he's working on other TV shows now. He's on NCIS. He was on the Goldbergs, that show. I don't watch the show, but I've seen some appearances that he's made on it, which is kind of cool. He's working on some movies, car shows. He also said that he's moving back to Texas, and Steve brings up how he has hookups in Texas, so if he needs any hookups, just to let him know. And Goldberg said that he smiled while driving to wherever this interview took place, the set of Broken Skull Sessions. He had said in California, so I assume it's near Austin's, wherever he lives in California. But he said he smiled while driving to the set that day because he enjoys just hanging out with Stone Cold Steve Austin. So I thought that was cool too, and that was a great note to end on. So overall, great conversation. Clocks in at around an hour and 11 minutes. So my I was wondering, initially a few days ago, like how long was this thing going to be? Because the Taker one was like an hour and 45 minutes. It was kind of long, an hour 37 maybe. This one was long too, not as long. But still very informational, a lot of fun. Love the camaraderie here between Stone Cold Steve Austin and Goldberg. Goldberg's obviously very comfortable talking to Stone Cold, so we shared a lot of stories that we haven't heard before. Talking about a lot about his football days, upbringing, wrestling, his personal life, meeting his wife, his son. I thought they really covered everything. The only thing I would have liked to have heard him touch upon was the Taker stuff. And it's not like, oh, this was taped beforehand, so that's why they didn't talk about it. No, this was taped well afterward, and they didn't bring it up. I thought they were promoted and discussing it. Maybe not. Maybe it's an extra. I don't know. Maybe they cut it. I'm not sure. But other than that, though, I thought this was great. Be sure to check it out on the WWE Network, Broken Skull Sessions with Stone Cold Steve Austin and Goldberg. And hopefully, as I said earlier, they can make this a regular thing after all the pay-per-views. I don't know how many episodes they taped. Maybe Stone Cold has already announced who his next guest is, but I thought the Taker one was awesome. This one was just as enjoyable. Hopefully they can get another home run out of this with the next one. I don't know why you wouldn't do one after the Rumble, because the Rumble is one of their highest, viewed pay-per-views of the year. So if you're going to do this one after the fucking TLC pay-per-view that I'm sure not a lot of people watched, I know I didn't watch it. As of this recording, I still have yet to watch TLC. If that's going to be the case, then why not just do one after the Rumble too? Because if you're going to watch the Rumble, then people that may not ordinarily watch the other pay-per-view events may stick around to watch Stone Cold Steve Austin shoot the shit with Sting or Hulk Hogan. He already talked to him on his podcast earlier this year, but someone along those lines. Hopefully they don't, throw us a curveball with as I said at the start of the show, they did these early on where he had Vince on and then Triple H. It's like, oh, cool. And then he had on Paul Heyman, which was cool, and then Paige. It's like, who gives a fuck? Who gives a shit about Paige talking with Stone Cold Steve Austin? That was probably inaudible because I think it was supposed to be Hogan before he got fired. Paige was kind of a weird choice, though. I think they did it to promote Tough Enough. I don't know. It was just a weird fucking choice, and the interview was awkward as all hell. But anyway, I'm looking forward to the next one if there is a next one, and this was great, so be sure to like the video, drop a comment, share the video, and subscribe to the channel for more content. Don't think there's anything airing after Raw tonight. If there is, I'll be watching it hopefully tomorrow and reviewing it tomorrow here on the channel. If not, something might be up, we'll say. But otherwise, guys, I'm not sure when the next Network and Show video will go up. I think there's a new day of maybe going up next weekend. There's something going up next weekend that I forgot about. I don't know if it's a Chronicle. We had the Rey Mysterio Chronicle go up on Saturday. I broke that down yesterday here on the channel, so check that out if you haven't already. And that's about it. So have a great one, guys. Enjoy the rest of your week. I'm Graham G.S. Matthews, and I'll catch your ass down the road.